The wind howled across the barren landscape, biting through Ruth Winslow's threadbare shawl. She had been walking for hours, no, days perhaps. It didn't matter anymore. Her boots, already worn thin, split at the seams with each step, but Ruth didn't stop. She couldn't. Stopping meant surrendering, accepting that she wouldn't make it, and she wasn't ready for that. Clutched in her arms was her baby, Hope, wrapped in a quilt so tattered it was barely recognizable. Hope didn't cry anymore. The little one hadn't for days. Ruth knew deep down that the tiny, fragile body had given up. But she refused to admit it. She refused to stop moving. Her heart ached with each step, each breath, as though the weight of the world had taken root in her chest. But there was nothing to do but keep walking. Ruth reached the crossroads at sunset, the long shadows stretching across the snow-covered ground. 4 roads met in front of her, all leading to the unknown. Each path was the same, endless and empty. She didn't know where they went or where she was supposed to turn. She had lost the sense of direction long ago. The roads didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore except getting through the next minute, the next hour. That's when she heard it, hooves beating steadily against the cold earth. At first, it was just a distant sound, but then it grew louder, the rhythm unmistakable. She looked up, and through the swirling snow, she saw a rider approaching, a tall, broad-shouldered man, his horse cutting through the storm with ease. Ruth had no idea who he was, but as he drew nearer, the look in his eyes spoke volumes. His expression was quiet, steady, unchanging. He didn't look at her with pity. He didn't look at her as a widow, as someone who had lost everything. He simply looked at her as someone who needed help. He slowed the horse and stopped a few feet away. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but it carried authority. "You're lost," he observed, more statement than question. Ruth didn't beg. She had no tears left to cry, no strength to plead. She simply nodded, the weight of her exhaustion making her words impossible. "I'm lost," she whispered, almost as if saying the words aloud would make them true. She had lost more than her way on the roads. She had lost her sense of self. She had been running from grief, from judgment, and from everything she had lost. The man looked at her for a long moment. "Then follow me home," he said, his words simple and direct. It wasn't an offer of charity. It wasn't an offer of rescue. It was just a simple, quiet invitation. Ruth's heart skipped a beat, not because she trusted him immediately, but because for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a choice. The unexpected encounter Grant McCoy had made his fortune in timber, amassing mills across the Montana Territory. His business had grown from the sweat of his brow, the sharpness of his mind, and the endless hours he spent working the land. But none of that was evident in the way he dressed. His coat was worn from years of hard work, and his boots were as battered as hers. He had never been one to flaunt his wealth. He wore it, like most things, simply and practically. As he rode up to Ruth, he didn't see a widow or a woman in need of charity. He saw someone who had endured too much, someone who was caught in a storm she couldn't escape. Her eyes were worn with grief, but there was something else in them, something that made him feel like he had seen this pain before, in his own reflection. Grant had lost his wife, Anna, years ago. He had never fully recovered from that loss, even though he had tried to bury it under the weight of work and success. When he saw Ruth standing there, cradling her lifeless baby in her arms, his heart ached for her. He had seen so many women in his life, women who had been lost to grief. But Ruth's grief was different. It was raw, it was palpable. She wasn't asking for help, she wasn't begging. She was simply standing at the crossroads, trapped between the past and the future, unsure of which road to take. "I'm lost," Ruth had said, her voice barely above a whisper. There were no tears in her eyes, just the quiet, painful acceptance of everything she had lost. Without hesitation, Grant had responded, He didn't ask questions. He didn't pry into her past. He simply offered her something, no conditions, no judgment, just an invitation. "Then follow me home." Ruth looked at him, her body trembling with exhaustion, but for the first time in days, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance to start again, to leave the pain behind and find something new. As Grant helped Ruth onto his horse with hope tucked between them, the storm seemed to momentarily ease. The wind didn't howl as loudly. The snow didn't seem as cold. Ruth's grip on Grant tightened, not out of fear, but out of an unexpected trust. He didn't promise her anything. He didn't offer her a new life, but he did offer her something she had long since given up on: a chance. The ride towards home. As they rode through the thickening snowstorm, Ruth felt the warmth of Grant's body next to hers, a warmth she hadn't felt in months. His steady presence gave her a strange sense of security. It wasn't that he had promised her safety or that he had made any grand declarations about fixing her broken life. He had simply offered her something she hadn't expected: kindness. The storm raged around them, the wind howling through the night, but Ruth found herself leaning into the comfort of Grant's quiet strength. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't rushing to get to some destination. He was simply taking her to a place of refuge, a place where she could rest for the night. That was all she needed. Just a moment of peace. For the first time since her husband's death, Ruth didn't feel like she was alone in the world. She had been carrying the weight of grief, judgment, and loss for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to share her burden. But here, on this horse, with Grant by her side, she felt like she was no longer walking this road alone. Grant didn't speak much as they rode. He simply guided the horse, his hands steady on the reins. Ruth noticed the care with which he moved, the way he seemed to anticipate the terrain ahead, the way he kept them on track despite the raging storm. There was a quiet confidence in him, something that Ruth found oddly reassuring. "How far?" Ruth's voice was barely audible over the wind, but Grant heard her. "Far enough," he answered, his tone steady, not giving away anything about where they were headed. Ruth didn't ask more. She didn't need to. She had long ago learned that life didn't offer many answers. Sometimes all you could do was move forward step by step and hope that the path would eventually open up before you. The storm was worsening, the snow falling in thick sheets that obscured everything around them. Ruth could barely see through the blinding white, but she trusted Grant. He knew this land. He knew where he was going, and in a way, Ruth realized, so did she. For the first time in months, she had stopped running. She was ready to face whatever came next. Her grip on Grant tightened once more. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, but filled with a gratitude she couldn't fully express. Grant glanced down at her, his face still set, but there was something in his eyes, something like understanding. He didn't need to say anything. He simply nodded. Ruth felt it, an unspoken promise that for as long as they were together, she wouldn't be alone, seeking shelter in the storm. The storm continued to rage around them as they rode deeper into the wilderness. The wind howled with such ferocity that Ruth could barely hear herself think, the icy gusts biting through her clothing and chilling her to the bone. The snow fell harder now, thick sheets of white that obscured the path ahead, and Ruth felt her exhaustion creeping back in, dragging at her limbs, heavy with the weight of everything she had carried. Her head drooped slightly as her mind tried to shut out the cold, but she stayed awake, not wanting to risk losing control of the moment. Grant, however, remained calm and steady. He didn't rush, didn't seem affected by the storm as much as she did. His horse moved confidently through the snow, his grip on the reins steady, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Ruth glanced up at him, and despite the storm, she felt a small spark of trust begin to build within her. He wasn't just leading the horse, he was guiding her through the darkness. And then, through the swirling snow, Ruth saw something, a faint outline in the distance. It was barely visible through the white, but it stood out against the blizzard. A cabin. Grant had spotted it too. His eyes shifted toward it, and Ruth felt a flicker of hope. The cabin was small and run down, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. It looked abandoned, but it offered the only refuge from the storm. Grant didn't hesitate. He turned the horse toward it and urged it forward, cutting through the snow as best as they could. When they arrived, Ruth felt an unexpected wave of relief wash over her. The door to the shack was partially open, and Grant didn't waste a moment. He dismounted quickly, helping Ruth down from the horse, and they both made their way inside. The small cabin was cold, but it was shelter. It was a reprieve from the relentless storm outside. Inside, the air was musty and damp, the walls worn and cracked from years of neglect. A few old blankets were piled in a corner, and a simple stone fireplace sat across from them. Ruth's heart lifted slightly at the sight of it. The fireplace was intact, and even though there was no fire burning, it meant they could start one. Grant quickly got to work, gathering some dried wood and kindling from the pile in the corner. Ruth sat near the wall, pulling the quilt tighter around her body. Her hands were frozen, numb from the cold, but the weight of the storm outside kept her anchored in this small, dimly lit space. As Grant worked, Ruth watched him. There was something about the way he moved, his deliberate actions, his careful attention to the fire, something that spoke to his patience, his calm strength. It was a quality she hadn't seen in a long time, not in herself, and certainly not in others. In his quiet way, Grant was offering her something she hadn't expected. Stability. It wasn't grand, but it was real. The fire began to crackle, and soon the cabin was filled with warmth. Ruth sat by the hearth, letting the fire's heat seep into her skin, and for the first time in days, she let herself relax. The storm continued to howl outside, but inside, the cabin felt like a small sanctuary, a place where she could rest, if only for a moment. Grant sat across from her, and their silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like the kind of silence shared between two people who had no need for words. For a long time, Ruth hadn't known peace. But here, in this humble cabin, surrounded by nothing but the storm and the fire, she felt it begin to stir within her. Quiet conversations and shared silence. As the fire crackled softly, the warmth slowly spreading through the small cabin, Ruth leaned back against the wall, her eyes closing for a brief moment. The exhaustion from the journey, from the emotional weight she had carried for so long, was starting to ease. The constant tension in her muscles began to loosen, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax. Grant didn't speak right away. He continued tending to the fire, adding logs carefully, watching the flames flicker and dance as they grew stronger. Ruth noticed how focused he was, how deliberate his every movement seemed. It wasn't urgency that drove him. It was an unhurried sense of care, as though he understood the importance of patience. Ruth hadn't realized how much she had missed that. Patience. The world she had been a part of before had never allowed her the luxury of waiting. Life had always been about survival, about moving on to the next task, the next road, the next town. But here with Grant, she didn't have to rush. She could simply be. And for once, she allowed herself to simply sit, to breathe, and to exist without fear of what came next. After a long while, Grant looked up from the fire and met her gaze. His eyes, dark and steady, held no judgment, just quiet understanding. Ruth couldn't help but notice the small things about him, the way his hands moved when he spoke, the slight furrow of his brow when he thought. and the quiet way he observed the world around him. It was different from what she had known, different from the hurried, often harsh world she had lived in before. Finally, Grant broke the silence. "You've had a long road," he said, his voice gentle, not probing, just acknowledging. "But it's not the road that defines you. It's what you do with it." Ruth blinked, his words sinking in slowly. She had spent so much time trying to outrun her grief, trying to forget the past, but Grant was right. It wasn't the road she had traveled that mattered. It was what she was doing now. It was the choice she was making in this moment, right here, right now. "I don't know where I'm going," Ruth admitted quietly. "I never thought I'd be here with you in this cabin in the middle of a snowstorm, but I feel like I'm starting to see something I haven't seen in a long time." Grant gave her a slight nod, his eyes soft but unwavering. "You're seeing yourself, Ruth? The person who's still in there, still strong, still fighting. It's just buried under a lot of weight." Ruth's chest tightened at his words. It was the first time anyone had ever said that to her. Not that she was a victim of her circumstances, not that she was a broken woman, but that she was still strong, still capable of finding herself again. The silence between them was not awkward. It was comfortable, a shared understanding hanging in the air. As the fire grew warmer, Ruth felt a shift inside herself. She wasn't lost anymore, not completely. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small cabin, there was a growing warmth, not just from the fire, but from the space between her and Grant, building trust and the unspoken bond. The days that followed seemed to pass in a quiet, almost soothing routine. Ruth took to the small tasks around the cabin with a purpose she hadn't known she still had in her. She cooked, she cleaned, and she began to care for the small space that had become her sanctuary. Each movement, each task, felt like a small act of reclaiming her life. Grant, too, kept busy with his work around the ranch. There was always something to do, fences to repair, horses to tend to, wood to chop. He moved through the tasks with quiet efficiency, never rushing, always steady. Ruth had noticed how he didn't speak much, but when he did, his words were meaningful. His actions always spoke louder. He wasn't one to offer empty comfort or false promises. He simply did what needed to be done. The connection between them grew quietly, steadily. It wasn't rushed. They didn't force each other to speak about their pasts, nor did they try to fill the silence with unnecessary words. There was a shared understanding between them, something that Ruth couldn't quite explain. It was a silent bond built not on grand gestures, but on the small, meaningful things they did for one another. One evening, as the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, Ruth found herself watching Grant from across the room. He had been working all day, his hands rough from the chores, his face set with quiet determination. Yet there was something soft about him in this moment. His shoulders were relaxed, his movements unhurried, and there was a gentleness in his eyes when he looked at her. Ruth had spent so many years closing herself off from the world, from the possibility of connection. But now, with Grant by her side, she realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let that go. The quiet bond between them wasn't based on pity or obligation. It was based on respect, on understanding, on the shared experience of grief and survival. She met his gaze, her voice quiet but steady. "You've given me more than I could ever repay," she said softly, her heart full of gratitude. Grant looked at her for a long moment before responding, his voice just as soft. "I'm not asking for anything in return, Ruth. We're in this together. That's enough." And for the first time, Ruth believed him. It wasn't charity, it wasn't a favor, it was simply two people, healing side by side, each one learning to trust again. The growing connection. The days continued to flow in a steady rhythm, and Ruth felt herself becoming more settled in the quiet routine of life at the cabin. The hard edges of her grief were slowly softening, each day bringing a little more peace, a little more acceptance. It wasn't just the physical work that was keeping her busy, though the tasks of cooking, cleaning, and caring for Hope helped keep her mind occupied. It was the simple acts of kindness, of shared silence with Grant, that were healing her in ways she hadn't expected. She found herself noticing things she hadn't before. The way Grant moved around the cabin, always thoughtful, always purposeful. The way he'd glance over at her when he thought she wasn't looking, as if checking to make sure she was all right. His quiet steadiness was both comforting and reassuring, and in his presence, Ruth began to feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. Safety. There were no grand gestures between them, no dramatic declarations of love, but there didn't need to be. The connection between them was being built in the quiet moments, the way their eyes met across the room, the shared laughter over small things, the warmth of their hands brushing together as they worked side by side. Ruth found herself looking forward to these moments, to the simple comfort of being with someone who didn't need anything from her, except her presence. One evening, as Ruth and Grant sat together by the fire, Hope asleep in her crib nearby, Ruth found herself lost in thought. It was late, and the cabin was bathed in the soft, golden glow of the firelight. Ruth couldn't help but smile as she watched the fire dance. The world outside was cold, harsh, and unforgiving, but in this little cabin with Grant beside her, it felt like the world was manageable. Grant shifted beside her, sensing her thoughts. He turned his head to look at her, his expression soft. "You okay?" he asked gently, his voice warm but steady. Ruth smiled, the corners of her lips lifting for the first time in days. "I'm better than okay," she said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. But here, with you, I feel like maybe I can start over. Maybe I can stop running." Grant nodded, his expression soft but knowing. "You don't have to run anymore," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "You're not alone anymore. We're in this together, Ruth. We've both got our pasts, but we've also got this. And that's enough." Ruth's heart swelled with emotion at his words. The simple truth of them, the fact that Grant wasn't asking anything from her except for her presence, was the most healing thing she had experienced. "I think I've spent so long running from my past, I forgot what it felt like to stand still," she admitted softly. "But I don't want to run anymore. I want to build something here, with you." Something real. Grant's eyes met hers, and for the first time Ruth saw something in them, something beyond just quiet understanding. She saw hope, too. The same kind of hope that she was beginning to feel within herself. "There's no rush," Grant said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll take it one day at a time." Together, Ruth didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore, and that was enough. Facing judgment life in the cabin with Grant was peaceful, quiet, and steady. The rhythm of their days, the work, the meals, the laughter, had slowly transformed the space into a home. Hope was thriving, her cries and giggles filling the air with life. The land, once harsh and cold, was beginning to feel like a place where they belonged. Ruth had never imagined she could find peace again, but in this small cabin, in the presence of Grant and Hope, she began to believe it was possible. But peace, as Ruth had learned, never lasted long. Word of Ruth's presence at the cabin had spread. The small town, so used to its quiet, predictable life, had started to talk. Ruth knew it was coming. She had known from the moment she stepped foot on the land that the town wouldn't simply let her disappear into the wilderness. They wouldn't let her live in peace, not after everything they had heard about her. One afternoon, as Ruth and Grant worked together outside, They saw the dust rising in the distance. Ruth's heart sank. She knew who it was. The sheriff, Reverend Silas, a few others. They had come to settle what they perceived as a matter of decency. Ruth didn't have to be told. She had already heard the rumors. She had already felt their eyes upon her. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about the fact that she, a widow, was living in the same cabin with a man who was not her husband. Ruth stood still, her breath catching in her throat. She felt the weight of their judgment before they even spoke a word. Grant, as always, was calm. He didn't look at Ruth with fear or concern. He simply turned to face the approaching men, his posture steady, his jaw set in quiet defiance. The sheriff was the first to speak. "Grant McCoy," he said, his tone thick with judgment. "This woman you're harboring here, she's been trouble wherever she's gone. The whole town knows her reputation, and yet here she is, living with you." "It's not right." Ruth's chest tightened, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. The words she wanted to say felt stuck in her throat. She had heard this before. The whispers, the accusations, the judgment that followed her wherever she went. Grant didn't hesitate. He turned to face the sheriff, his voice firm but calm. "Ruth stays," he said simply. "And if you've got a problem with that, you can take it up with me." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, but Grant stood his ground. Ruth felt something shift inside her. Grant was standing up for her, not just for the life they had built, but for her dignity. He wasn't doing it out of pity or obligation. He was doing it because he believed in her, in what they were creating together. Reverend Silas stepped forward, his voice laced with condemnation. "You know the rules, McCoy. This woman, she's an outcast. She's caused nothing but trouble." Grant's eyes darkened, but his voice remained steady. "You don't know anything about her. You don't know what she's been through, and you don't get to decide what happens here." Ruth felt a weight lift off her chest. Grant wasn't just defending her. He was defending their home, their family, their future. For the first time, Ruth didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she had a place here. She had a voice. And with Grant by her side, she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. The townsmen exchanged uncertain glances. The sheriff's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. He turned his horse and signaled for the others to follow. As they rode off, Ruth stood beside Grant, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and strength. Grant looked at her, his expression soft. "You did well," he said simply. Ruth smiled, her throat tight with emotion. "We did." Ruth's moment of courage. The days after the confrontation with the townspeople were quieter, but Ruth couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease. The town's judgment had not gone away. The whispers would continue. She could already feel the weight of their opinions, lingering like a shadow. But this time, Ruth didn't let it affect her as she had before. She had made her stand. With Grant beside her, she had chosen her path. One afternoon, as Ruth and Grant worked together, she looked around the cabin, noticing how it had transformed over the months. It wasn't just a structure, it was a home, and they had built it together. Every nail, every beam, every simple, quiet moment had gone into making it theirs. Hope's laughter filled the air, the sound of her tiny feet pattering across the floor as she began to crawl. The cabin was alive again. Ruth felt herself changing, too. The woman who had once felt like she was constantly running, constantly hiding from the world, was becoming someone different, stronger, more confident, more willing to face whatever came next. It was a late afternoon when Ruth finally found herself standing outside, her hand resting on the wooden fence that separated the cabin from the rest of the land. Grant was a few yards away, working with the animals. Ruth watched him for a moment, the light of the setting sun casting a golden glow over his face. She took a deep breath and walked toward him. As she approached, Grant turned and smiled, his face softening at the sight of her. Ruth met his gaze, her heart swelling with the emotion she had tried to hide for so long. "You've given me more than I thought I could have," Ruth said quietly. Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of vulnerability in it that she hadn't allowed herself to show before. Grant took her hand in his touch warm and reassuring. "You're stronger than you think, Ruth," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We both are." And in that moment, Ruth realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. She had found her way home, not just to Grant, but to herself. New beginnings and hope. The weeks passed and the cabin continued to grow with life. The first hints of spring arrived, melting the last remnants of snow, and Ruth felt something else beginning to bloom inside her. Hope was thriving, her laughter filling the cabin with the joy Ruth had almost forgotten. The land outside had started to thaw, its rugged beauty now visible under the sunlight, and the air, though still cold at times, held the promise of something new. Grant and Ruth's bond had deepened over time. There were no grand gestures, no moments of drama. What they had was real, a simple, quiet love that had been built on trust, mutual respect, and the understanding that they both had their pasts, but it was the future they were choosing, together. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Ruth looked out at the land before her. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, casting a soft, golden glow over everything. Grant sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders. Hope had long since gone to sleep, tucked warmly in her bed. "I didn't think I'd ever find peace again," Ruth said softly, her voice steady but full of emotion. "But here, with you, I feel like I can finally breathe again. I'm starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, I can start over." Grant squeezed her hand, his voice low. "We're both starting over, Ruth. And we'll do it together. Whatever comes, we'll face it. Together." And in that moment, Ruth realized something powerful. The storm had passed. The road ahead wasn't clear, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had found a home in herself, in Grant, and in the small family they had made together. And that, she thought as she leaned her head against his shoulder, was enough.